How well do you know someone? How well do you know your own spouse, your parent, your friend? Some people are able to hide who they truly are, and the case we're talking about today involves an individual who managed to conceal their true self for decades. Alec Murdaugh was able to not only hide the monster that he was, but he was able to create a completely fake life and present himself as a successful lawyer from a prominent family that had the picture-perfect life, with a loving marriage, a close relationship with his two sons, millions of dollars, gorgeous multiple homes, international vacations on private jets, fancy cars and toys, everything you could possibly want. Many people would easily describe this as the perfect life, but Alec Murdaugh's life was a shiny veneer, held on by a complicated web of lies. When Alec Murdaugh's lies came undone, he was revealed to not only be a monster hiding in plain sight, but involved in multiple murders, the theft of millions of dollars from needy people, close to half a dozen suspicious deaths, roadside shootings, missing evidence, manipulated statements, fabricated interviews, a multi-season Netflix series, and a HBO miniseries, plus one of the most watched trials of all time that could actually result in a mistrial due to jury tampering. So today we'll be discussing how Alec Murdaugh and his family went from having it all, what most people would describe as the picture-perfect life, to losing absolutely everything they held near and dear, including two of their own lives. One of the biggest and most talked about cases of recent years has been about a prominent South Carolina family known as the Murdaughs. It looks as though the Murdaugh case is going to continue dominating the headlines due to the recent revelations, which may grant Alec Murdaugh a new trial regarding the murder of his own family members. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Later in the video, we'll not only discuss the trial of Alec Murdaugh for the murder of his wife and youngest son Paul, but why he may be granted a new trial and some other information you may not know about the Murdaugh murders. Today we'll also be going over all of Alec Murdaugh's fraud and theft cases, where he in fact stole millions of dollars from his own clients who desperately needed the money. Tied in with Alec Murdaugh's fraud and murder charges are several other mysterious deaths linked to the Murdaughs. And of course we'll be discussing the event that triggered the crumbling of the Murdaugh dynasty, the deadly boat crash caused by Alec's son Paul. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in to the downfall of the Murdaugh dynasty. To begin with, we're just going to go over a little bit of background about the Murdaugh family, and if you know who all the family members are and you know a basic bit of history about them, then you can skip to the timestamp on the screen, as that's when we're going to begin to discuss all of the incidents that happen and also the deep dark spiral that this family falls into. The Murdaughs are a prominent family from the Low Country in South Carolina. They have been dominating the headlines in the last several years across the US and the globe for the fall of their family's dynasty. The Murdaughs lived in a town called Hampton, South Carolina, and the majority of the family members were lawyers dating back to well over 100 years ago. From 1920 until 2006, a Murdaugh family member served as the county's solicitor, which is basically the same thing as a district attorney. This solicitor serves 5 county areas of South Carolina's Low Country within the 14th Judicial District. The Murdaughs wielded enormous power, and many people in Hampton thought that due to their connections to law enforcement, that the Murdaughs could get away with anything, even murder. And yes, that is foreshadowing. While Randolph Murdaugh Sr., Randolph Murdaugh Jr., and Randolph Murdaugh III all served as the solicitors of the 14th District, the Murdaugh family also opened and operated a law firm founded by Randolph Sr. in 1910. A lot of people have pointed out the hypocrisy of them being on both sides of the table. The Murdaugh law firm, which was called Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elstrick, and Dietrich PMPED, specialized in personal injury litigation. Due to the events we're about to discuss in this video, the law group ceased operations and changed its name to the Parker Law Group last year in 2022 after over 100 years of practice. Randolph Murdaugh III, known as Handsome, married a woman called Miss Libby, and together they had 4 children, 1 daughter Lynn and 3 sons, Randolph Murdaugh IV, Richard Alexander Murdaugh, and John Marvin Murdaugh. Miss Libby was a teacher that then served on the school board, and according to people in Hampton, she easily won all her re-elections. Miss Libby also was the co-owner of a small boutique called Branches with her daughter-in-law Maggie Murdaugh, who we'll discuss extensively in this video. Both Randolph IV, known as Randy, and Richard Alexander Murdaugh, who went by Alec but spelled like Alex, both became attorneys. Lynn became a victim's advocate, and John Marvin owns a rental business. The family traditionally went to undergrad and law school at the University of South Carolina, and Alec also followed in these family footsteps. While at USC, he met and married his future wife, Maggie Branstetter. After a few years working in other practices, Alec and Maggie returned to Alec's native Hampton, a small town in South Carolina's Lowcountry with less than 3,000 residents. After moving back to Hampton in 1994 with his wife Maggie and his toddler son, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., who goes by Buster, Alec began working at the family law firm PMPED. Alec's older brother Randy was also working at PMPED, and Alec mainly focused on personal injury cases. Over his 2 decades as a lawyer, he did also serve as volunteer solicitor and handled a small number of cases over the years. Alec's personal injury cases were mainly accident related, and not only was Alec very successful, the entire Murdaugh family was very successful, and the law firm was as well, with the lawyers at the firm frequently achieving bonuses in the high 6 figures and sometimes even the 7 figures. From the outside looking in, Alec Murdaugh lived a charmed life. He was from a successful, powerful, and rich family. He had an excellent, high-powered job with a very large salary. He had a wife and 2 sons. He had multiple properties, including a beach property in Edisto and a hunting lodge, Moselle, which had over 1,800 acres. He had everything that he could possibly want, with gorgeous houses, land, nice cars, holidays on private jets, the best of everything, and his sons Buster and Paul seemed to want for nothing. If you looked at this family from the outside in January 2019, everything appeared to be perfect for the Murdaughs. But by 2023, the mask had slipped and things looked very different. The Murdaughs were tied to multiple deaths, fraud, the theft of millions of dollars from needy people, and the loss of their power, money, influence, reputation, freedom, and in some cases, even their lives. We're going to start by discussing the event that caused the first domino to fall in the Murdaugh case. This event caused Alec Murdaugh's web of lies to come undone, and for the mask he'd worn all his life to finally come off. In February 2019, on a normal Saturday night in Hampton, South Carolina, 6 friends, who were all between 19 and 20 years old, decided to go to a party, specifically an oyster roast. This is a pretty common occurrence in the colder months in South Carolina, but these 6 friends had no idea that this decision was going to impact all of their lives forever. The 6 friends consisted of 3 couples: Paul Murdaugh and his girlfriend Morgan Doherty, Mallory Beach and her boyfriend Anthony Cook, and Miley Altman and her boyfriend Connor Cook, who was also Anthony's cousin. The 6 friends were very close, especially the 3 girls, and although some of them didn't want to go to the oyster roast, ultimately they all decided to go. Paul Murdaugh knew that that evening there was going to be traffic stops and DUI checks, so he decided to take his father's boat. Paul hooked his father's boat up to his white pickup truck, and on the way to his family's river house where all the friends were going to meet to launch the boat, he stopped at Parker's gas station to fill up and also buy alcohol. Paul Murdaugh used his older brother's ID to purchase the alcohol, as his brother Buster had obtained a duplicate copy of his ID for Paul to use. Paul Murdaugh purchased about $50 worth of alcohol, and the 3 couples headed to the Murdaugh family river house and started drinking. Before they set off in the boat for the oyster roast, Paul had funneled 6 beers, and when the kids arrived at the oyster roast, they continued to drink. But as Paul Murdaugh always did, he took drinking to a different level. Paul Murdaugh was known for drinking to excessive extents, and this evening was no different. By the end of the night, Paul had got pretty belligerent. This was such a common occurrence that his friends had even given his drunken alter ego a nickname, Timmy. Drinking and driving seemed to also be a very regular occurrence for Paul Murdaugh, as even though he was completely hammered, no one at the oyster roast, including his own Uncle Randy, who was there, seemed to worry too much about the issue of him drinking and driving the boat. The only comments that were made by other people at the party was that it was getting dark and cold, and that's the reason that they might not want to drive the boat back. Paul's ex-girlfriend Morgan Doherty has also spoken to Netflix about getting into a car accident with Paul when he was drunk. They were driving in his truck and it flipped over, and Paul called his grandfather, as he usually did, to get him out of trouble. Paul's grandfather and his parents both showed up to clean up the crash site, and Paul Murdaugh and his parents even chastised Morgan for attempting to call 911 and said that Morgan could have got their son in trouble. Not the drinking and driving, but the fact that Morgan was going to call the authorities. It's starting to get late at the oyster roast, and the 6 friends decide to leave. They all leave on the boat, and while they're leaving, Paul and Connor are adamant that they're going to stop in downtown Beaufort for more drinks. So they do make that decision to stop and have more alcohol, and unfortunately this decision was most likely the catalyst for only 5 of the passengers making it home that evening. Paul and Connor stop at a bar called Luther's, and Paul orders several shots for them. After drinking more, Paul and Connor return to the boat, and this is when CCTV footage captures the kids walking down the day dock, and this is the last time that the 6 of them would ever be seen together, because in the next hour, one of these friends would be dead. The boat sets off, and immediately Paul Murdaugh starts driving erratically. CCTV footage also captured the boat speeding and driving around in circles. The rest of the group tries to convince Paul to let one of the others drive, to stop speeding, and just to get them home. Towards the end, some even ask to be dropped off at the dock because they're scared of Paul's driving. Paul takes off his shirt and begins screaming at the rest of the group. He goes up to his girlfriend Morgan Doherty and screams in her face and asks her why she doesn't have his back. Morgan said, why would she have his back when he's behaving so poorly? Paul then slaps Morgan and calls her disgusting names, insults her family, and spits on her.
He just started calling her like a bitch, and he was like, you're such a whore.
Paul Murdaugh then walks up to the throttle of the boat, slams it down, and the boat accelerates and smashes into the bridge. The front of the boat hits the bridge and the back of the boat goes up, and absolute chaos erupts. When the boat hits the bridge, Anthony Cook and Mallory Beach were in the back of the boat, so both of them are ejected from the boat along with Paul Murdaugh. Connor Cook smashes into the right side of the boat, cracks the windshield and some rod holders, and breaks his jaw, and he also gets a laceration to his face. Miley and Morgan were in the front of the boat sitting on a cooler. Miley had her feet up on the front of the boat, so that pretty much protects her from feeling a lot of the impact. Morgan is thrown forward and her hand is smashed between the front of the boat and the bridge. The scene is absolute chaos. Most of the kids are badly injured. They're screaming. Paul had taken off some of his clothes before the accident, and after being in the water, removes everything except his boxers. Morgan's hand is pouring blood, and all of the kids were pretty intoxicated, scared, and didn't know what to do. Anthony and Paul swim out of the water and get up onto the bank of the river, and this is when Miley comes up to Anthony and asks, "Where's Mallory?" The group then realizes that their friend Mallory is missing. Anthony, Mallory's boyfriend, jumps back into the water and is diving, coming up, diving, but the current is so strong and he stays in the water as long as he possibly can. While Anthony is looking for Mallory, Connor Cook, through a broken jaw, dials 911.
A boat? Did you say a boat crash?
A boat crash. There's 6 of us and one is missing. Please send someone.
No, we're calling, okay?
911 sends ambulances, cops, fire and rescue, the Coast Guard, they send everyone. The problem is there's another bridge near where the kids have crashed, and that bridge is referred to as the Paris Island Bridge. The emergency services accidentally go there. There's further confusion with finding the kids, and it actually takes around 30 minutes for EMS to arrive on the scene, with cops being the first people to arrive. Morgan, Miley, Connor and Anthony's main concern is the fact that they cannot find Mallory.
We hit a bridge in the boat. Connor's messed up bad. We can't find Mallory. Morgan's messed up bad. We can't find Mallory.
Hey, we're looking right now, Paul. They're down there looking, okay? But they got a good search on them, right? Yeah. They probably don't find anything. They didn't find anything, okay? They're down there looking right now, okay? You know they got it. That's a good search, right?
Anthony is furious with Paul, and while there is a lot of body cams, dash cams, and audio from the scene that night, there's a lot missing. And a lot of people will tell you that the reason it's missing is because a lot of the investigators who arrived at that scene had very close ties to the Murdaughs. At one stage, Anthony tells the lead deputy for the first 24 hours, Michael Brock, Paul Murdaugh killed my girlfriend, and that audio is not in evidence. Michael Brock has close ties to the Murdaugh family.
Get that right there away from me. Bro, you smiling like it's funny. My girlfriend gone, bro. Do you think it's funny? Oh, he's right. Yeah.
Do y'all know Alec Murdaugh?
Oh, yeah, I know that name.
That's his son.
That's so
Good luck.
There seems to be an immediate effort to protect Paul. One of the DNR agents on the scene, Michael Paul Thomas, is best friends with Alec Murdaugh's brother, aka Paul's uncle, John Marvin Murdaugh, and Paul's ex-girlfriend Morgan of 4 years described Michael Paul Thomas as Alec Murdaugh's bitch, and that he got Paul out of a ton of trouble. At no point in the evening does any officer give Paul Murdaugh any sort of breathalyzer or sobriety test, despite the fact that he is absolutely trashed, and several of the kids tell officers that Paul was driving the boat. Before the kids are transported to the hospital, Paul borrows Miley's phone and calls his grandfather, Randolph III, the former solicitor, a man with great power and influence in South Carolina. Paul tells old Buster that Cotton Top was driving the boat, and Cotton Top is Connor Cook's nickname. Miley, Morgan, Connor, and Paul are all transported to the hospital. Despite being injured, Anthony refuses to leave the crash site without Mallory. Paul has to be restrained and transported in an ambulance by himself because he was so out of control and drunk. When they arrive at the hospital, Randolph and Alec arrive at the hospital and immediately jump into lawyer mode. They tell the kids not to say anything to the police, and Alec Murdaugh does not seem concerned about the fact that Mallory is missing or that any of the kids are injured. He just wants to protect his son. I do quickly just want to note here that when Alec Murdaugh showed up at the hospital, he could have still legitimately believed what Paul had told his grandfather, and that's that Connor was driving the boat, because Alec learned about the crash from Paul's grandfather. We're looking at this event obviously now with hindsight, and we're not only aware of what Alec Murdaugh does before the crash with his financial crimes, but we're also aware of what transpires after this crash, which we'll talk about later in the video. Alec could have legitimately been trying to protect not only his own son, but his son's girlfriend and his son's extremely close childhood friends. I don't think his actions were too out of character for a lawyer, and I do think that even another lawyer from his firm that was in the same small town, if their kid was involved in an accident like this that involved alcohol, I don't think that they would have done anything too differently. Obviously, there's still a lot of things that were awful that he did. After that night, he went on to be incredibly manipulative, and that's when he knew that Paul was the driver. He also didn't seem to be concerned at all that a 19-year-old girl was missing. He didn't call her parents because we have all his phone logs. He didn't ask about the search, the resources for the search, or anything like that. And he also didn't seemed to be really concerned about the kids' injuries. I think his actions after that night were horrendous, but some of the documentaries and a good bit of discussion around this boat crash has put this very sinister slant on Alec's actions that night of basically just telling the kids not to say anything until their heads were on a bit straighter, and that he represented them, because we're viewing that with the hindsight of knowing how this story ends and what Alec goes on to do to his own wife and son, which of course we'll talk about later in the video. At the hospital, Paul is still acting out, with his grandfather being quoted as saying Paul can't be interviewed because he's drunker than Cooter Brown. The hospital staff has described Paul as the most arrogant and rude teenager to ever come through the ER. He was harassing nurses, acting out, making really inappropriate comments towards the nurses, and the ER staff actually took his blood to test it for alcohol levels, and his alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit whenever it was tested. But also keep in mind that this was several hours, over 2 hours after the crash, so he had 2 hours to burn off alcohol, so God knows what the level of the alcohol in his system was at the time of the actual crash. At the hospital, Paul continues to say Connor Cook was driving, and the next day when the media reports on the crash, they state that one of 2 boys was driving, Paul Murdaugh or Connor Cook.
Beaver County deputies determined one of 2 boys were driving, Paul Murdaugh or Connor Cook.
The next morning, Mallory Beach is still missing. Most of the kids have had to have treatment for their injuries. Morgan has had to have surgery on her hand. Anthony and Mallory's family are out on the riverbank every single day, hoping that Mallory will be found. An enormous amount of the community, pretty much anyone who had a boat, went out to help search for Mallory. Sadly, 1 week later, on the 3rd of March, some Good Samaritans who were assisting with the search found the body of Mallory Beach. An absolute waste and tragedy for Mallory's family and friends, and for Mallory herself. By all accounts, she seemed like a wonderful young woman who was extremely kind, and Mallory's family, rightfully so, wanted Paul Murdaugh held accountable for taking the life of their 19-year-old daughter who had her entire life ahead of her. Additionally, several of the kids had suffered quite severe injuries, and obviously the entire event was traumatizing for them to go through, being that they were in a crash that killed one of their friends. It appeared as though the Murdaughs were already trying to manipulate events and to push the blame onto Connor Cook. 1 month later, on April 18th, Paul Murdaugh was indicted on charges of boating under the influence, causing death, and 2 counts of boating under the influence, causing great bodily injury. Many people in Hampton thought that either nothing was going to come of this, or that the Murdaughs would use their influence and power to get Paul off lightly. Paul was facing over 25 years in prison for these charges. On May 6, 2019, Paul pleads not guilty to all charges. Mallory's mum wanted Paul to be held accountable, of course, and she was referred by a friend to a lawyer named Mark Tinsley. On behalf of the Beach family, Mark Tinsley files a wrongful death lawsuit. This lawsuit was against Parker's, the convenience store that Paul purchased the alcohol from that night. The lawsuit was also against Luther's, which was the bar that Paul and Connor drank at after the oyster roast, and the lawsuit also included 2 homeowners, Kirsty and James Wood, where the oyster roast was. So the lawsuit was against anyone who had served the 6 kids alcohol that night. The lawsuit was later amended to only name Richard Alexander Murdaugh Sr. and Jr., which is Alec, Paul's father, and Buster, Paul's brother, and also Parker's convenience store. Alec was named as it was his boat, and also because he had knowledge of Paul having an alcohol problem, and Alec still gave him his boat. Mark Tinsley also had collected evidence from the Murdaugh social media, as both Alec Murdaugh and Maggie Murdaugh, Paul's mother, had an avalanche of pictures and videos posted on there that had Paul drinking around them, and they'd also liked a number of pictures with Paul drinking or drunk, displaying that they clearly knew Paul drank to absolute excess. They also knew that Buster Murdaugh had obtained a duplicate ID ID that Paul was using to buy alcohol, and that duplicate ID was why Buster was sued. Not very much happened for 2 years. Obviously, COVID delayed things, and then unfortunately both Mark Tinsley and John Tiller, who was Alec's lawyer, were diagnosed with cancer. During the 2 years, Alec Murdaugh offered up the insurance money that he had, which was about $500,000, but also was claiming to Mark Tinsley that he was broke and couldn't pay anything more. He told Mark Tinsley he may be able to come up with $1 million, but that was it. Alex Murdaugh also approached Mark Tinsley at an event and said, "Hey Bo, what's this you've been saying? I thought we were friends." And Mark Tinsley told Alec Murdaugh they were friends, but he would be doing everything he could for his client and that Alec was going to have to pay out of his own pocket. Mark told Alec that he would be looking for around $10 million. Mark and the Beaches thought it was odd that Alec was claiming he was broke, as they knew not only did Alec have generational wealth, but that he was earning millions of dollars as an attorney. Mark told Alec that he needed to turn over his finances to prove he was broke, but Alec Murdaugh couldn't turn over those finances because one look at them and people would realize that for over a decade Alec Murdaugh had been stealing millions of dollars. So in this chapter, we're going to briefly discuss the financial crimes at the center of the Murdaugh saga. So put a pin in everything from the boat crash case because that all is very important and we'll tie it all together when we talk about the trial. As I mentioned, Alec Murdaugh was earning millions of dollars, and for over a decade, it honestly could be longer, he was stealing from his own clients and law firm. Alec was a personal injury lawyer, so a lot of his cases were people who had severe injuries, and some of these plaintiffs had even passed away. They had lifelong injuries. Some of these people had lost limbs. One of his clients he stole from was a quadriplegic. There was people that could no longer work, like a police officer who had a terrible injury to his neck, and Alec stole from all of these people, the vast majority of whom were low income. In case you weren't aware, a lot of lawyers who work in this area don't charge fees, but instead take a percentage of what they would win for their client. Usually this is between 33 and 40% of whatever they win. So most of the cases, they end up being settled. And if the case is settled, they'll take 33% because they haven't gone to trial. They haven't had to do all the discovery and it's not as much work. But if it does go to full on trial, the lawyers will take closer to 40%. Basically, the expenses are taken out, any liens are taken out, so those could be things like medical bills, and they're paid for the client, and then the lawyers take their 33 to 40% and the rest goes to the client. Most of the settlements Alec Murdaugh was working on were for a lot of money. Anything from $100,000 to millions and millions of dollars. One final thing to explain before we get into the actual financial crimes is that a lot of clients won't take their money in one big lump sum. They will put it into a structured annuity, which is basically done to help with taxes and to also help people be able to stagger the money out and not blow it all in a few years. Another benefit is that a lot of these clients will have lifelong injuries or require assistance or home health care. So when these payments are set up in an annuity, the payments for things like home health care can be structured that way too. So there's a company that actually does this that's based in Atlanta that's called Forge Consulting, that's run by a man named Michael Gunn. And what ends up happening is someone will win their case, say they've just won a case for $1 million to make it easy. The expenses were 40%. That gets taken out. They had a $10,000 medical bill lien that gets taken out, and then the lawyer will take the 33.33%. So $316,635 will end up going to the lawyer, and then the client is left with $633,365. So the client would take that 600 and change thousand and put it into Forge Consulting, and then Forge would structure the payments and drip it out to the client over several years. And that's pretty much the end of the case. So Alec Murdaugh was able to steal from his clients for a very long time because he was very good at talking to people, at reading people, and also because the way that he structured his theft was very thought out and very premeditated. And he also had high-powered accomplices to help him do this. So Alec basically set up a bank account at Bank of America through the help of his friend Russell Lafitte. This is a person from another prominent South Carolina family, the Lafittes, who run a lot of the banks in that area. So Alec didn't have to go through the usual checks that normal people do. So he sets up the account, but not in his name. He sets it up doing business as Forge. So it is his account, but whenever you look on the card or the checks or any of the information, it's Forge bank account. And Alec Murdaugh then would gain the trust of all his clients, and in a lot of cases he would end up suggesting to these clients, because they trusted him, that they get a PR, which is a personal representative, and that PR person would then mean that Alec wouldn't have to discuss the plaintiff's case with them. He would only discuss it with the PR person, and he would end up getting his high-powered friends to be the PR, like Russell Lafitte. So Alec has this Forge account set up, and then he smooth talks his clients. They end up trusting him, and he lies about the money that was won, or he lies about winning money at all and says, oh no, you didn't win anything. And then he ends up writing the checks or getting the checks written to Forge, not Forge Consulting, the actual company that we talked about that's based in Atlanta, but to Forge. And then he ends up depositing those checks into his Forge Bank of America account. So Alec would win a case, and he won a lot of cases, and a lot of lawyers that he worked with also said that he was very good at reading people and capable of using emotions on or against people, and that he would actually end up winning cases for a lot more money than he should have won. So he would win the case, the expenses would be paid, the attorney's fees taken out, and then it would be sent into his law firm, and the client's money would be put in a check form, written out to Forge, and then he would cash the Forge check into his Bank of America Forge account. His law firm would just see, oh, the check went to Forge, that's totally normal, and they wouldn't think anything more of it. Alec stole over $10 million from clients this way. One of the largest thefts was from the children of his former housekeeper and his son's nanny, Gloria Satterfield, who worked for the Murdaughs for over 20 years and then worked for Alec's parents even before that. Gloria also died under suspicious circumstances at Alec Murdaugh's Moselle property when she, according to the Murdaughs, fell down brick steps after the family dogs knocked her over. At Gloria's funeral, Murdaugh approached Gloria's sons and told them that he was going to sue himself and that the boys should go see his friend Corey Fleming, and Corey would set them up with some money. Alec Murdaugh, Corey Fleming, and Russell Lafitte did a lot of these schemes together, and Russell Lafitte and Corey Fleming have also been charged for their involvement with Alec Murdaugh's crimes. Gloria Satterfield's case ended up being settled for over $4.3 million, and her sons did not get one penny. There's more to the Gloria Satterfield case and some of the other cases linked to the Murdaughs, so maybe I will cover those in a follow-up video. If people are interested in this video, let me know down in the comments. So Alec Murdaugh was doing this for years and years, and when Mark Tinsley requested his finances, that meant that the banks would send over every account with Alec's name on it. It would be obvious very quickly, as Alec Murdaugh made the majority of his money once a year, as all the lawyers at his firm did. At PMPED, the lawyers were paid a monthly salary, the equivalent to to just under $200,000 a year. And then at the end of the year, they would get their bonus check. The bonus check was broken up between all the lawyers from the accumulated lawyers' fees they'd all won that year. How much the bonus check was for depended on how many cases they did, how much they earned for the firm, but these bonus checks were huge and the vast majority of their income. They were really high in the six figures and sometimes even in the seven figures. So someone would look at Alec's bank statement and know he's not getting all these huge payments throughout the year. He should just be getting his salary and then the one big bonus payment in December. But he was having hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars coming into these accounts through this fake forge account. So at the beginning of June, I want to set the scene. Alec Murdaugh has been stealing clients' money as far back as the early 2010s. The boat crash civil suit is going to cause this to all come out and reveal him as a thief, liar, manipulator, and drug addict, as he was using some of the money to fund an oxycodone habit. His older son Buster has also been sued civilly, and he has just been kicked out of the University of South Carolina Law School for plagiarism. His youngest son Paul could face up to 25 years in prison, and the civil case is going to cause Alec Murdaugh to owe up to 8 figures. Things are beginning to come undone for Alec, and to make things even worse, on June the 4th, the mediation in the civil case fails, making it seem as though the boat crash civil case is going to go to court, meaning that Mark Tinsley is going to get access to his financial records. Reporters surrounding the boat crash case are also exposing other skeletons in his closet, and to top it all off, he's gotten sloppy, and his law firm have just found a trail of breadcrumbs that are going to expose all of his financial crimes. Alec goes to work on Monday, June 7th around noon. Apparently, he's not a morning person. He goes in to do some work on the boat case as both the criminal and civil case are proceeding, and he's going to have to hand over his financial information very soon. While he's at work, he's approached by a woman called Jeannie Seconder. Jeannie is the CFO of his firm, PMPED, and she's known Alec since she was 16 years old, and in a weird twist, her brother-in-law is actually Russell Lafitte, one of Alec's accomplices. Jeannie has approached Alec to ask him about the missing money from the Ferris case. Alec had worked on this case with his best friend Chris Wilson, and as Chris was the primary attorney, he handled the payment, which was in a trust account that only Chris controlled. When it came time for Chris to send the expenses payment and Alec's attorney's fees, Alec asked Chris to send the expenses only to PMPED, and Alec claimed that he had spoken to the firm about his fee and that it could be paid directly by check to Alec. As mentioned before, usually all the fees go into a pool and the lawyers then all get their bonus check from the fees once a year in December. Alec was Chris's best friend, and of course Chris trusted him. So Chris sent the expenses check to PMPED and gave Alec the check for his fees. Alec's paralegal, Annette Griswold, had discovered that some fees were missing and had spoken to Jeannie, and after some investigation by Jeannie, she believed that Alec had received the fees himself. Jeannie and Annette weren't actually worried in the beginning that Alec was stealing. What they were worried about was that Alec was trying to hide money and put it in Maggie's name rather than his own, because the boat crash civil case was going to come after Alec for money, so if it was in Maggie's name, they wouldn't be able to touch it. A few minutes into the conversation with Jeannie, where she had confronted Alec about the missing fees, Alec received a phone call about his father's health, and he was told his father was terminal and did not have much longer to live. Jeannie immediately tabled the conversation about the fee and asked about his father. Alec then went home from work early that day, as he'd asked both Paul and Maggie to come and stay at Moselle, the family's 1,800-acre hunting property. The judge in the boat crash case had allowed Paul to go to college, and he was attending the University of South Carolina. With the impending civil and criminal case for the boat crash, things were stressful for the Murdaughs. Both Paul and Maggie didn't even realize how stressful as they seemingly were both unaware of what Alec was actually doing. Paul was dealing with a lot of backlash for his actions. The Hampton community thought that he was receiving special treatment, as Paul spent no time in jail, he wasn't handcuffed, he didn't wear the orange suit, and even his mugshot was taken in the hallway after court as opposed to being traditionally booked. He also received a lot of hate on social media. Due to it being summer, Paul was home from USC and was working for his uncle John Marvin, and had stayed at John Marvin's the night before. Maggie had been staying at the family's beach house in Edisto. Maggie was not living in Hampton anymore because of everything that happened with the boat crash. She felt like people were shunning her in the community, and she saw also how Paul was being treated, so she preferred to stay over at the beach house. Due to Alec's father not doing well, Maggie went to Moselle to be with Alec, and Alec had also asked Paul to come home to help sort out the sunflower field after their groundskeeper, CB, had apparently destroyed the sunflowers. When Alec returned to Moselle after a few hours of work, Maggie was not there yet as she had a doctor's appointment in Charleston. So Alec and Paul rode the property, sorted the sunflowers out, shot some shotguns, looked for hogs, and just generally checked on the vast property. While out on the property, Paul took a video of Alec playing with a tree. This video would become very important later, so bank that in the back of your mind. Later on in the evening, Maggie returned home. Maggie, Alec, and Paul all had dinner together, but by the end of the evening, only one of them would be left alive. After finishing dinner, Paul and Maggie went down to the dog kennels, a short walk from the house or a very short drive in a golf cart. Paul appears to have taken a golf cart and Maggie had her car down at the kennels. Later that night, Alec told investigators he had had a nap, woke up at 9 p.m. and then once he got up, got himself together, texted Paul and Maggie and said he was going to check on his mum and dad. He then gets in his car and drives less than 20 minutes to his mother and father's house, which is named Almeda. On his drive to and from Almeda, Alec places a large number of phone calls. People do report that it is common for not only Alec but all the Murdaughs to call people while they're driving, but the amount of calls does seem quite excessive. His father is sadly terminally ill in hospital. Due to Alec's mother suffering from dementia, the only witness to really be able to place Alec at Almeda is Miss Shelley, who is Miss Libby's caretaker. Alec later tells investigators that he stayed for 45 minutes to an hour at Almeda, although there's some discrepancy here between Alec's account and Miss Shelley's, but we'll discuss that later. Alec then drives home to Moselle. He arrives around 10:07 and discovers an absolutely horrifying scene. Alec goes to the house and discovers Paul and Maggie aren't there, so he goes down to the kennels to check on them. When he arrives, the dogs are barking. The scene is chaotic. Both Paul and Maggie's bodies are lying on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds. Paul's wounds are to his neck and head. They are so severe that Paul is almost unrecognizable. Alec told investigators that night that he immediately ran to check on Paul, checked for a pulse, tried to turn him over, and when he did so, Paul's phone came out of his pocket. Alec said he picked up the phone and, quote, tried to do something, end quote, and then put it down. He then goes over about 30 feet away to Maggie, checks Maggie's pulse, and then calls 911. Approximately 20 minutes after calling 911, police officers respond. Before officers arrive, while still on the phone with 911, Alec asks to hang up from 911 to call his family members. That evening, Alec's family come to Moselle, along with all the attorneys from his law firm. Alec is interviewed by investigators and gives the details I've relayed in this telling. From the 911 call, throughout the interviews, and throughout the entire evening when he's repeating the story to family and friends and colleagues, Alec constantly and repeatedly tells investigators that he believes this shooting is retaliation from the boat crash. Buster has driven down with his girlfriend from a few hours away where they live, and the Murdaugh family and all the lawyers stay with Buster and Alec until 4 a.m. They then leave the property to go and stay at a family member's. So that was the timeline, schedule, and story according to Alec. But what Alec told investigators was complete and utter bullshit. In fact, Alec was not only with Maggie and Paul minutes before the murders, but there's recorded evidence to prove this. The real timeline, or as accurate as we can be by piecing together video recordings, cell phone data, car GPS, and on-store records, is as follows. 8:44 p.m. Paul records the infamous kennel video. This video proves that Alec was with them moments before the end of their lives. This video was not found for over a year because they couldn't get into Paul's phone, but thankfully they found it before the trial and Alec's story shattered. In this video, Paul is recording it for his friend Rogan Gibson. Rogan had left his dog Cash at the Murdaughs' kennels as Rogan lived about 2 miles away from Moselle but was not living at the house at the time. His dog Cash went to stay at Moselle and Paul noticed something odd with Cash's tail. He attempted to FaceTime Rogan so he could see the dog, but the cell phone reception at Moselle is terrible. They tried a few times to make the call, and when they couldn't get it to work, Paul decided to take a video and send it to Rogan. At 8:44, Paul makes the short video recording of Cash. In the video, you can hear 3 people speaking. Paul is speaking to Cash, and you can also hear Maggie and Alec talking to their dog, Bubba, who has grabbed a chicken. Maggie and Alec had 2 dogs, Grady and Bubba, that normally Maggie always had with her. They were the main family dogs. Bubba had a chicken in his mouth, and you can hear Alec, clear as anything, speaking.
Quick, Cash. Come. Quick. What's the matter? Come here. Come on, man. Come here, Cash. Shit. Come here. Close to me. Cash.
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth.
Hey, Bubba.
That's a guinea.
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba.
Come here, Cash.
Come here, Bubba.
Cash. Quick.
This places him at the scene of the crimes moments before they happened. Alec now claims that he took the chicken from Bubba's mouth and then immediately left on the golf cart, returned to the house, lay down for a few moments, then got up and left the property and went to his parents' house. Another thing that was incredibly weird was that Alec Murdaugh, when he was down at the kennels when this video was taken, he did not have his cell phone with him. He left it at the house. And many people, family and friends and colleagues, testified that Alec was never without his cell phone. I have a really detailed timeline of the night, and I will put it in the pinned comment. I always put all of my sources in the pinned comment. This will be everything that I use for the video, like all the clips, but it also includes anything that I've read, watched, listened to, and I've put everything, as always, in the pinned comment. So if you want to know more, I really suggest starting with those sources because there's some really great ones down there. Also, I just wanted to say that because I wanted to explain where I'm getting the information from, and this is literally from the trial. Like, this is the document that they used at the trial that the investigators and SLED and everybody was using. All through this report, you can see Maggie, Alec, and Paul using their phones throughout the day. It's like every time they pick up the phone, every time the phone, turns on, a call is placed, a text is, like, it has everything that happens on those phones, like even when the flashlight turns on. So it's incredibly detailed. Investigators believe that Paul and Maggie lost their lives around 9 p.m. or slightly just before, because at 8:49, Paul's phone locks forever, even though he's in active conversation with Rogan and he's texting a girl back and forth. And also at 8:49, Maggie's phone locks forever. There are some orientation change, but the phone is locked. locked. All this time, as I mentioned, Alex Murdaugh's phone has been locked and not moving, as he's left the phone at the house. And also, as I mentioned, many people who know Alec testified that this is very out of character for him. At 9:02 to 9:06, Alec is shown to travel 283 steps. In this time, Alec calls Maggie. She doesn't answer. He also starts his car. He calls Maggie again, and at 9:07, Alec leaves Moselle for his parents' house. A minute later, Alec texts Maggie and says, "Going to check on M, be right back." He drives to his parents' house and makes several phone calls. Actually, a lot of phone calls. He calls Buster, he calls his brother, he calls his best friend Chris Wilson, and he arrives at his parents' house at 9:22. Alec's phone shows several steps. Also, his phone is sitting in his Suburban for a few minutes when he arrives. Alec claims his phone had fallen down the side of the seat and he was fishing it out. Of course, the other side of this is he could have left the phone in the car while he quickly did something. We'll talk more about that and this whole night in general and what the prosecution claims when we talk about the trial. His mother's caretaker, Miss Shelley, sees him and tells him his mother's in bed. He's at Alameda for 20 minutes, leaving at 9:43. Alec arrives at Alameda at 9:22, and by 9:43, he's leaving. Alec drives back to Moselle, and while driving, he makes several more phone calls, several to Paul and Maggie, and also sends text messages to them. 10 o'clock on the dot, Alec's Suburban turns into Moselle, and Alec goes to the main house. He then sees Maggie and Paul aren't at the house, and at 10:05, Alec drives down to the kennels. At 10:06, 17 seconds after arriving, Alec calls 911. In this 17 seconds, Alec claims he got out of his car, saw the horrendous scene before him, went over to his son Paul, checked for a pulse, tried to turn Paul over, picked up Paul's phone that fell out of his pocket, put it down, ran the 30 feet over to Maggie, checked her pulse, and then called 911. Due to Moselle being quite far out and pretty late at night, it takes about 20 minutes for the first police officers to arrive. While on the phone with 911, Alec goes to get a gun from the house. We have the body cam of the first officer on the scene, and we can get quite a large amount of information from this. I do just want to put another warning in here. I am going to be showing some of the body cam. Mainly it is of Alec and the cops, and Paul and Maggie's bodies are completely blurred out, of course, but there is some blood on a sheet that you may see, and also just the whole thought behind, like, this is a real crime scene where two people really lost their lives. So I just want to put that warning out there for anybody who wants to either skip or just exit the video altogether. I totally understand. So if that's not something that you want to hear or see, skip to the next chapter. There's only a little tiny bit of this section left, and all the timestamps are down below, so just skip to chapter 5. When the cops arrive, Alec is wearing a white shirt and grey shorts. Bank that for in your memory for later. Despite saying that he checked the pulses of both Maggie and Paul, Alec did not have one drop of blood on him. The cops begin investigating and they collect evidence from the kennels only. That evening, the cops interview Alec along with his personal attorney, who also works with him, Danny Henderson, tying him to one story, which was, I took a 45-minute nap and didn't see them, went to my parents for an hour and a half and came back. When really, he actually saw them a few minutes before they lost their lives, and he was only at his parents for 20 minutes, not an hour. One other thing of note to hold on to is that evening, Alec called all his family members, every attorney from the firm, and they all traipsed through the house. Some may even suggest that this was his plan, having a huge group of people stomping through his home and grounds, which at that time was a crime scene. So all those people coming in and walking around, touching things, it destroyed any possible evidence that had been left behind, as neither the police nor SLED went to the house that evening, and they didn't collect any evidence from the house. We'll talk about that a lot more during the trial chapter, but it's even things as simple as if Alec changed his clothes and had a shower and washed evidence down the drain, that if they went that night, they could have retrieved that evidence. But by the time they did show up with a warrant to search the house, that evidence was long gone. But we'll discuss everything the cops discovered, everything they didn't discover, and just what happened that night in general at Moselle, or as close to knowing what we can. We'll discuss all that in the trial chapter, but first we have one short chapter to discuss something wild that happened, because next chapter is when things really become undone, when Alec Murdaugh's world begins to finally unravel, and he's finally caught in more ways than one. This chapter will be brief before we get into all of the crazy events of the trial, but this chapter is still full of bizarre and wild happenings. After the murders in June, for the rest of the summer, the authorities stayed very quiet on what was happening with the case. No suspects, no sketches, no weapons, no information, no leaks at all. Also, due to the events, Alec's law firm PMPED had paused all discussions with him about the missing funds. And very importantly, Alec's theft was also not revealed via the boat crash civil case, as there was supposed to be a hearing the week that Maggie and Paul lost their lives. But of course, with the events, the hearing did not go forward as planned. Alec Murdaugh had bought himself enough time to return the funds that his firm was questioning that he'd stolen from the Ferris case. September 2021 rolls around and things heat up again for Alec Murdaugh. During the first week of September, more irregularities were flagged when it came to Murdaugh's accounts. And on September 4th, Alec Murdaugh's world came crashing down. His fraud and theft of over $8 million was discovered by his law firm. The law firm that his great-grandfather founded over 100 years ago, the one that he and his brother worked at following in their great-grandfather, grandfather, and father's footsteps. As mentioned earlier in this video, the CFO, Jeannie Seconder, had found Alec Murdaugh's theft after Alec's paralegal, Annette Griswold, flagged a suspicious payment. The CFO, Jeannie, had previously approached Murdaugh on June 7th, but later that day, due to the events that we now know happened with Maggie and Paul, the discussion about the missing funds was put on the back burner. But after more evidence was found, Jeannie brought her findings to the partners and showed them the black and white proof that Alec Murdaugh had been stealing from them and their own clients. Jeannie actually had no idea at the time that her own brother-in-law, Russell Lafitte, was involved in Murdaugh's scheme. Alec's brother Randy and another partner approached Alec with the theft allegations, and Alec Murdaugh admitted that he had been stealing. Alec tried to cling on to his job, admitting that he had a substance problem and offered to go to rehab, but Alec was forced to resign. Later that day, Alec was allegedly driving to Charleston. However, he wasn't driving on the road that locals would usually take from Hampton to Charleston. Alec claimed that he stopped to change a flat tire that he had while driving his late wife's Mercedes. He stopped on the side of the road to put the spare tire on, someone stopped to help him, and according to Alec, this person shot at him. He was transported to hospital via helicopter, as this is the protocol with gunshot wounds to the head. His lawyers allegedly told reporters to go to a different hospital than the one he was taken to, and many members of the press believe this was done so that Alec wouldn't be questioned by the press. Murdaugh had a superficial wound that definitely doesn't seem to be a gunshot wound. Alec claimed that he'd asked his dealer, distant cousin, and friend Eddie Smith to shoot him and to take his life so that his son Buster could receive a $10 million life insurance. Cousin Eddie told a very different story. Many people think that Alec Murdaugh was trying to set Eddie up, wanting to be shot at, as so it would seem like the killer who had taken Paul and Maggie's life had returned to finish off Alec. In reality, it seems as though this was all orchestrated by Alec Murdaugh himself, as along with not only being on the wrong road, there are many other things that did not add up when it came to this story. For one, I have the exact same car that Maggie had, and not only is there not a spare tire on that car, they actually have run flat tires, so you can travel up to 50 miles on them when you get a flat. Also, apparently, there was no life insurance policy on Murdaugh or any of the family members, let alone one for $10 million. After his stage shooting, Murdaugh and his lawyers released a statement saying he had resigned from his law firm, but he didn't mention the fact that he was forced to resign due to stealing. Alex stated he was only resigning because he had an addiction that was exacerbated by what happened to Maggie and Paul, and that he's going to go to rehab. Later that day, the law firm PMPED clarified why Alec was forced to resign. Absolutely disgraced, Alec Murdaugh then heads to rehab in Florida. And when he leaves South Carolina for Orlando, he will never, ever step foot in South Carolina as a free man again. So now we're going to discuss the trial, and given that the trial was 6 weeks, I cannot go into every single detail that happened at the trial, but I'm basically going to go over what the prosecution alleges the motives were for Alec Murdaugh to commit these crimes, and we'll also discuss the witnesses and where we basically ended at the trial with what the prosecution was saying, what the defense was saying, and things like what evidence did we have, what evidence didn't we have, and go through everything with the sentencing as well. So I'm going to jump straight into that. And September 3rd, as we've just previously discussed, Alec resigns from his law firm because basically he had to, because he was stealing. And then on September 4th, he is shot. 2 days later, when he's discharged from hospital on September 6th, Alec goes into rehab in Orlando, Florida. And when he is leaving rehab on October 14th, 2021, Alec Murdaugh is finally arrested. When Murdaugh was arrested after coming out of rehab in Florida, he actually was charged with 2 felonies over the stolen funds, and primarily the one from Gloria Satterfield, as it was such a large amount, millions of dollars, over 4.3 million. So he hadn't actually been arrested for the murders yet. On December 13th, 2021, Alec's bond is set for $7 million. This was based on the nearly 50 financial crimes that he was charged with at that time. On June 28th, 2022, Alec is indicted for conspiracy. Murdaugh and his cousin Smith were indicted by the state's grand jury on 2 conspiracy counts, including a narcotics count related to oxycodone. The Supreme Court of South Carolina disbars Murdaugh from practicing law due to his reprehensible admitted misconduct. On July 14th, 2022, so quite a while after he's been charged with the financial crimes, Alec Murdaugh is charged with the murders of his wife, Maggie Murdaugh, and his youngest son, Paul Murdaugh. A grand jury indicted him for these 2 counts. On July 20th, 2022, Alec Murdaugh pleads not guilty at a bond hearing.
What say you, Richard Alec Murdaugh? Are you guilty or not guilty of the felonies wherein you stand indicted?
Not guilty.
And his bond is actually denied. In December 2022, Alec is charged with tax evasion, and then on January 23rd, 2022, the trial finally begins with jury selection. So let's start with a very loose timeline of the trial and some of the big key events that happened. So the trial started, as I said, on January 23rd, the jury was selected, and on January 27th, the police testified that when they arrived at the scene, there was not one drop of blood on Alec's clothes. And this was even though he claimed that he went and touched both of the victims and checked for a pulse. And as I said, you can see from the even just like the blurred out scene that I talked about with the police when they come and investigate the crime scene, there is absolutely just blood everywhere. And you can see at one point there's even a police officer, when they're holding up the sheet that has blood all over it, that he's trying to look for a place to plant his foot because there is just blood and body parts and bone fragments, skull fragments everywhere. So there is no way that anybody could touch either of those victims and not get a drop on them. When Alec's lawyers cross-examined the detective who talked about the fact that he didn't have a drop on him, they also said, oh, well, he didn't look like someone who had just committed this crime. I'm really sorry that I have to be so sensitive about my language when I'm discussing the crime. It's completely YouTube. They will suppress the video if you don't. They suppress videos if you don't monetize them, and I've had that happen before too. So in order to be able to monetize it, I have to be careful with the language, and I have taken the monetization off videos before so that I can discuss them, and they just get completely suppressed, and it's not even worth doing. That's also why I don't do sponsorships, because I don't want people, one, to not watch the videos or to have to like skip through or something because the sponsorship, I mean, it's interrupting the video, let's be honest. And also I think it looks not the greatest to be discussing not only things like this, crimes, but also discussing scams and frauds, and then you're putting in some sponsorship. So that I just wanted to put that in there about the sensitive language. So sorry, it's not something I choose to do. So anyway, when they're discussing the crime, Jim Griffin, Alec's lawyer, basically says to the detective that, well, he didn't have blood on him, so he couldn't have committed the crimes. And she says, well, he might not have been wearing those clothes when he did it. We know that he was wearing those clothes when he went to check for the pulses because, you know, he called 911 and the police arrived. But this is where also that video that I said to bank comes in, because Alec, as you've seen through the footage I've shared, when the police arrive, he's wearing a white t-shirt and grey shorts. And when his housekeeper, Blanca, was asked about what he was wearing for work that day, she said he was wearing like a seafoam polo shirt and khakis, his normal work shoes, and a blue blazer. So most people, I know, even myself, like when I get home from work, I normally get changed into like a t-shirt and sweatpants or something. Most people change once a day unless they have, and then obviously your pajamas, unless they have, you know, a job where they're working a lot outside, they're getting very dirty, or they have, I don't know, like horse riding. I used to change a lot when I did that because you have specific clothes for that. Or if you, lived 20 years in Florida, sometimes you change a bit more there because it's hot. There's no reason that Alec should have changed 3 times. So he had always told police that he had just changed the once. And really, we found out he actually had changed twice because this video was uploaded to Snapchat that Paul took where he's wearing like a light blue button-up dress shirt and khaki pants as well. And this outfit, if he committed the crimes, he would have been wearing that outfit. And that outfit was never seen again. The shoes, the shirt, nothing. And they ask Alec's housekeeper, Blanca, about it a few times on the stand. And she says she never saw it again. And it just was not what he was wearing to work that day. So he did try and insinuate that he was wearing that light blue and what he was wearing in the tree video to work that day. But Blanca testified that he was not. So speaking of Blanca, actually Alec tried to pressure Blanca into lying for him, and that was over the whole what he was wearing, and he tried to basically tell Blanca that he was wearing that. And obviously she's very sharp, which you can tell on the stand, and she knows what he was wearing that day. And Blanca wasn't the only person he tried to manipulate and, plant some false memory. Basically, he also lied to Miss Shelley, who was his mother's caretaker. And as we know from all the data with the phones and OnStar and everything like that, you know exactly to the second how long Alec was at Almeida. But at this stage, they hadn't got all that information yet. And it was when they were still at the investigation stage. And basically, Alec was trying to tell Michelle that he was there at his parents' house for an hour and a half, so including driving time, and saying, oh yeah, I visited for an hour, when really he was only there for 20 minutes. And Shelley then obviously testified on the stand that he was only there for 20 minutes. And he was actually at Almeida a little bit longer than that. And that is because when he arrived, he alleges that he was trying to get his phone out from behind or like down the side of the seat. But most people believe this is when he was getting rid of not only the murder weapons, but also his clothes, because there is this time that you cannot allocate. His phone was in the car, let's just say that. So like when he was down at the kennels, and we know he was there because there's recorded evidence of it, but his phone was still at the house. He could have just left his phone in the car while he went and hid something at his parents, and then later obviously he went back, got those weapons, and then dumped them somewhere in a swamp or water, because the surrounding area that he is, I mean, you could hide stuff in there and no one would ever find it. So February 7th was a pretty big day, because this was when Jeannie Seckinger, who was the CFO of PMPED, testified about all of the theft that Alec had committed with all of the financial crimes. But this is also where they were able to point towards a possible motivation for Alec. So Jeannie went into Alec's office, as I basically did like a quick summary of this in the chapter about Moselle. And Jeannie went in on June 7th, which was the day that Maggie and Paul lost their lives, and told Alec that she believed he had stolen these attorney's fees from the case that he did with his friend Chris Wilson. And this is when Alec got the phone call about his father being terminal, and then immediately that's when Jeannie changed the conversation and kind of just left it on the back burner for then. So the prosecution alleged that that created sympathy, so it bought him time, because he was able to then go and get money and replace it in Chris Wilson's trust account so the firm wouldn't find out. But also there is the big motivation, which is to do with Mark Tinsley and the boat crash, and we'll talk about that in a second. On February 15th, Maggie Murdaugh's sister testifies about a strange conversation she had with Alec, and this was to do with Alec saying that his number one motivation was to clear Paul's name over the boat crash incident, when Maggie's sister, whose name's Marion Proctor, was saying that her number one motivation would be finding out who took the lives of Maggie and Paul. On February 21st, Buster Murdaugh took the stand. This is Alec's only living son, and he mainly testified about his father in a positive light, about, you know, his upbringing and things like that. So there wasn't really anything too significant that Buster said on the stand, because obviously most of it was in a positive light for his father. February 23rd and 24th, Alec Murdaugh takes the stand in his own defense. Most people would describe this as a bad idea, because he just didn't really come across well on the stand. He was getting tripped up a lot, and then he broke down several times. Most people believed it to be orchestrated, and to him not really having any real tears, and he just got himself into some situations that did not look good. And he also admitted a lot of the financial crime stuff too when he was on the stand, so that's obviously not going to paint you in a very good light, but he couldn't really hide that information because obviously other witnesses were testifying about it too. I guess he didn't really have too much choice, because he had got himself into so many lies through what he told the police, or to quote him, or to misquote him rather, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave," and then he misquotes the second part and says, "Once I told a lie," when it's "when we first practiced to deceive," and he did a lot of deceiving. So obviously with the kennel video placing him at the scene of the crime minutes before it happened, he had to really say not the truth, because I'm sure this still was a fabrication, because I don't think he's capable of telling the truth.
Other than lying to them about going to the kennel, I was cooperative in every aspect of this investigation.
Very cooperative, except for maybe the most important fact of all, that you were at the murder scene with the victims just minutes before they died. Right?
I did not tell them that I went to the kennel.
But he then was able to say, "Oh, I lied to the police then, but I'm telling the truth now." And he said that he was at the kennels, but basically he took the chicken out of the dog's mouth and then said bye and got on the golf cart, went up to the house, and then kind of got together and left.
What did you do after that?
I left.
You left.
Now,
Just jumped on the golf cart and left.
Well, that's what I was getting ready to say. Did I get on the golf cart and leave that second? Probably not. But did I get on the golf cart and leave very quickly after that? I did.
Okay, yeah, I think you testified yesterday. I got out of there.
I did.
And there also is some evidence about that sort of what he was doing at the house before he went to Almeida that we'll also talk about in a second when it comes to the motivation, but also things that are sort of flagged in a lot of people's minds. On March 1st, the jury is able to visit Moselle, and the footage that I'm playing over the top of this clip, this is footage of the jury visiting the crime scene. So a lot of the footage that I was able to get of like the interior and stuff is because of them visiting. And there really isn't much more that happens, because we find out what happens, guilty or not guilty, in just 2 days. So I'm going to go over some of the flags, some of the motivations, some of the discrepancies and things that don't add up. And then we're going to discuss what happened and everything after that. So I've gone through a few of these while I was going through the timeline, but there's still a couple to kind of highlight. And the first thing that I really noticed when I started looking into this case with a lot more detail was the fact that when you're comparing the 911 call that they did with the boat crash and the one that Alec placed with Maggie and Paul, you hear the kids when Connor's placing the call to 911. And when you place a call to 911, the line is actually always open and recording, even when the phone's ringing. So that's why when the phone is ringing in the boat crash case, you hear the kids screaming, you hear all the chaos.
What bridge is, Paul, what bridge is this?
911, where's your emergency? Hello? Police, fire, EMS? Hello?
But when Alec calls, you don't hear anything. You hear like a little bit of dog barking maybe and just like background noise. But his screaming and crying and, you know, the sort of heavy breathing and things, that doesn't start until the operator picks up the phone. So it seemed like a switch was flipped when it came to Alec. I talked about him, you know, touching the victims and not getting any blood on him, but also there was just a few other things that I wanted to highlight about just generally what happened that night before we go into a few of the other things. So when he had left the kennels and when he had committed the crime and he goes up to the house to then leave to go to Almeida, he was walking at an extremely fast clip, faster than he had walked at any point in the day.
How long did it take you, if you were at the house at 8:49, how long before you went and laid on the couch?
I would have gone straight to the couch, probably. I may have gone by the sink, or I may have gotten a spit cup, but it would have been basically straight to the couch.
Straight to the couch?
Yes, sir.
And you're telling this jury that That's what happened, and you were back at the house at 8:49, and you lay down on the couch and dozed for a second, and then you were up with more steps in a shorter time period than you had done all day.
I mean, your number is 8:49. What I'm telling this jury is that I went down there, and when I took that chicken from Bubba, I would have said something to Mags. I got back on that golf cart, and I drove back to my house. After getting back to my house, I went inside, and in short order, I went to the couch. That's what I'm telling this jury.
And if you listen to him, he's saying he lay down on the couch for a second. It's 9 o'clock at night. I mean, most people are not, moving around at a fast pace at 9 o'clock at night towards the end of the day. So this just is something that's always stuck out in my mind too. Like, why was he rushing so much at that time? Was it because he only knew he had a tiny window to get from Moselle to his parents' house, get rid of the murder weapons, go back, call 911? So there's a lot of people that think that that is why he was rushing. So as I said, Jeannie, talked about how she actually approached Alec on the day of the murder.
And then did you go into Alec's office on June 7th, 2021 for proof that he had not taken the Chris Wilson fees?
Yes.
And then that conversation got delayed, correct?
Yes, got disrupted and delayed.
The murders happened?
Correct.
Did you receive an email in July leading you to believe that the Chris Wilson fees were in the account all along?
We did.
And then we moved to September when Annette Griswold, Alec's paralegal, did she bring you a check showing that in fact those checks had been written to Alec back in March of 2021?
That's correct.
And at
there's some other things that tie in with all the financial and the boat crash case. The biggest one to me is what the prosecution alleged the motivation was, and that was that it was Paul that Alec was getting rid of because he not only was looking at a very expensive civil case where they would come after Alec for like $10 million, there also was the criminal trial and just in general people, not really being too friendly to the Murdaughs after what had happened. And Maggie, because of that, actually just wanted to settle the case and basically leave Hampton. I mean, she kind of wasn't really living in Hampton anyway. She was living at the Ediso property, but she just wanted to be done with Hampton because she felt like the town had become hostile towards her. But the biggest part of that is the fact that Mark Tinsley, who was the lawyer for Mallory Beach's mom, Renee, he is the same type of lawyer that Alec is, in the sense that they are plaintiff's attorneys that basically are going after companies or people for injuries, deaths, things like that have happened, and coming after those people or companies for a financial settlement or going to a jury trial so that the jury can get them a financial settlement or a financial amount, because that really, I mean, it's not going to bring the person back or heal injuries or heal trauma, but it is holding the person or the company somewhat accountable. So with Alec and Buster being involved in the civil case, and as I've discussed before, Mark Tinsley had made it known that he wasn't just going to put a fix on this and let Alec, pay the insurance money and be done with it. He was coming after Alec for allegedly $10 million. And Alec had told him, I'm broke. Mark said, show me, because I don't believe you, because you're a rich lawyer that is, settling all these cases and you have generational wealth.
And the idea was, if you say you're broke, show me the books, and they had refused to with the response to this interrogatory, as well as others. Is that correct?
Correct. What I'm trying to do is put pressure. He doesn't want me to have access to his accounts. At the time, I think it's because I'll see how much money he actually is making and how much he has. And so, that's what I'm trying to do, is put pressure on him to force him into a settlement. You don't want it disclosed? Here are the keys to the jail. You enter into an agreement and let's go settle the case.
In the event, though, he doesn't settle in response to this, what information are you trying to get?
Well, it's certainly not a number. It's certainly not Alec's estimation of what his net value is. I wanted the accounts because I knew that the only way that he could be broke is that money had been hidden. And so I was going to look for and trace or begin that process of doing that.
So Alec knew that he was on a clock, that Mark was coming for his financial information that would expose everything to do with the fake forge account and all the financial crimes. But also, With the civil case, he was coming for $10 million for Alec, which he didn't have. And it's also important to remember, this was Alec's bread and butter. He knew exactly how these cases work, how these civil cases and settlements work. He knew that if someone was a victim of a vigilante and the life of their wife and son was taken, that they would not be held responsible in a civil case. Because as Mark Tinsley puts it, nice people get good verdicts.
Understand or have an idea of at least what had happened to Maggie and Paul, how they had been killed?
I did.
Did that have any effect, that tragedy of their deaths, did that have any effect on your assessment of the boat case and how everything fit together if things were how they initially appeared?
Yes, it did, and it would have ended the case.
It would have ended the case against who?
Against Alex Murdaugh.
And explain that to the jury. Why? What had changed after this terrible tragedy?
When you have a civil case, nice people get good verdicts. You really have to motivate a jury to want to help somebody in a civil case. And so if you compare, say, Attila the Hun with some sweet grandmother, who gets a better result? It's the sweet grandmother. If Alec is the victim of a vigilante, nobody's going to hold him accountable. Doesn't make any difference what he did or how clearly what he did contributed. The case would be over against Alec.
The sympathies of the case had changed if Alec had truly been, his family had been the victim of some vigilante or something like that.
The sympathies would have changed if that had been true.
Assessing those sympathies and those emotions in a case like this is what you do as a plaintiff's lawyer, is that correct?
It's what we try to do.
And it's what Alec Murdaugh used to do as well when he was a plaintiff's lawyer.
I think he was good at reading people and knowing what made them tick.
And when somebody has something happen to them like that, like a tragedy, they aren't going to be held accountable no matter what they did.
If Alec is the victim of a vigilante, nobody's going to hold him accountable. The case would be over.
So when it comes to the weapons, this is an incredibly important point, because the whole thing about the weapons that took Maggie and Paul's life, they were proven to be Murdaugh-owned weapons. And there was actually 2 guns used at the crime scene. One was a shotgun that was used to shoot Paul in the chest, and then, as I said before, through the neck and the head. He would have survived the chest injury, and obviously the one that made him almost recognizable was an instant impact. When it came to Maggie, she was shot several times and it was all over her body. She was hit in her arm, chest, and the final shot was delivered to her head when she was on the ground. And this weapon that was used on Maggie is called a blackout, and this gun was also used and owned by the Murdaughs. They actually went and did casing of the shells that are around Maggie, and they matched it perfectly to the shells that Paul and his friend had used to sight in the weapon many months ago. There's not a ballistics trail with shotguns, so it's hard to be able to say exactly that those were for a 100% fact, but the blackout was definitely a Murdaugh-owned gun, and it just seems like a weird thing that they had 2 guns at the crime scene, and a lot of people think that this was done to try and throw off the authorities so that they would think there was 2 shooters. But also, I can't think of someone, a vigilante, or someone who's going to go and commit a really heinous, horrendous crime like this, and that they would show up at the scene with no weapon. That's just incredibly strange. And also the fact that Moselle is in the middle of nowhere. It's way out on the outskirts of Hampton, and those places at night too are pitch black because there's no city lights or illumination or anything like that. And also, someone would have to be incredibly in tune with what the family's sort of whereabouts were, because it was very rare for Alec, Maggie, and Paul to all be staying at Moselle. We've heard throughout the trial Maggie very rarely stayed at Moselle now. So it just, all those things that I've discussed factored together, it just would be horrendously bad luck that the 20 minutes that you go and visit your mother, someone shows up with no weapons at your house in the middle of nowhere and is able to quickly take the life of your son and wife when you only left the scene moments ago, that you changed your clothes 3 times that day and the clothes disappeared, and there's just so many other things that I discussed, like that moment that you were hustling in the day is the one window of time where you would have to be picking up the pace because you've just committed this crime. There's also so many other things, like there was evidence that although Alec didn't stay at Moselle that night, that somebody had taken a shower. There was water on the scene, so people were saying he could have washed, everything down or cleaned himself up. There just seems to be a ton of evidence that there was only one person capable of committing this crime. And that's why on March 2nd, 2023, Alec Murdaugh was found guilty of murdering his wife Maggie and his son Paul. One day later, on March 3rd, Alec was sentenced to 2 life sentences to run consecutively.
Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments. In the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh, I sentence you for the term of the rest of your natural life. For the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably love so much, I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. Those sentences will run consecutive.
When I originally started working on this video, this chapter did not exist. The script went from the trial chapter into a wrap-up where I mentioned Alec Murdaugh was appealing his conviction, there was an outro, and the video was done. But while I was in the first stages of this video, when I do all the research, there was a big, enormous update. And that might change everything that I've just gone over about the trial, because it really is starting to look as though the trial may be completely thrown out and Alec Murdaugh might be given a new trial. And I don't mean a 1 in a million Hail Mary chance through an appeal. I mean, it is looking incredibly likely. About a week ago, the beginning of September, Alec Murdaugh's lawyers Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffiths held a press conference to levy some accusations at the clerk of the court, Becky Hill. According to 3 affidavits written by jury members, Becky Hill abused her position as clerk of the court and tampered with the jury multiple times. The accusations are plentiful, according to Alec Murdaugh's lawyers and the other jury members. Becky Hill allegedly had multiple private conversations with the jury foreperson, and it was also alleged that Hill told the jury not to be fooled by Alec Murdaugh on the stand, and that they should be easily able to see that he was lying and that they should look at his body language. There was also other accusations that apparently Hill got a juror thrown off the case on the very last day of trial when they were about to deliberate. This juror was leaning towards a not guilty verdict, and Becky Hill allegedly made up a story that the juror's ex-husband wrote on social media that the juror was discussing the trial. To anyone who followed the case, this woman was dubbed the egg juror. No one, including Becky Hill, when asked, has ever been able to find this post again, even going into the ex-husband's Facebook backend, and they couldn't find it in there either. The juror was removed from the case on the last day of deliberation. The juror's ex-husband was also spoken to, and he stated he had not spoken to his ex-wife in over a decade. There was also another accusation when it came to this juror, that allegedly when she was delivering a fridge to some tenants, that she discussed the case then too. These tenants, after being woken up in the middle of the night, brought in for questioning, woken up again, brought in for more questioning, they said that she never spoke about the case. Literally the day before I'm recording this, there was a hearing to talk about the date that they're going to hold the trial for Alec's financial crimes. At this hearing, Dick Harpootlian, Alec's lawyer, stated that there was a jury member that told another jury member that they desperately wanted to be on the Murdaugh trial because it was going to be so big and have so much publicity. There have been many more accusations regarding jury tampering, and if even one of these scores and scores of allegations are true, Alec Murdaugh will receive a retrial. Regardless if Murdaugh gets a retrial for the murder charges, he will return to court this year. It was just decided, as I said the day before that I'm recording this, that the financial crimes will be tried on November 21st. Alec Murdaugh did admit to all of these financial crimes, but the state still wishes to pursue a case against him rather than letting him plead guilty and make a deal. This is done because the state wants to make an example of Murdaugh, someone who has violated the law. Murdaugh was a licensed attorney, and the state believes that the public should witness a case against Murdaugh for his gross misconduct so the public can see that lawyers who violate the law will be dealt with and held accountable. The state also appears to be breaking the financial crimes up into chunks so that they can attempt to achieve 3 guilty verdicts across the financial crimes, which would mean that Murdaugh faces another life sentence. If I haven't earned your subscription yet, maybe check out one of my other videos, and I want to say thank you so much to anyone who's made it to the end of this video. Please leave MVP down in the comment section so I can thank you. I have my own little MVP here. I'll insert a little clip. She's been sitting here, my little cat, Miss Gloria, has been sitting listening to the entire video, which she normally does. It's so cute. And I just really, again, want to reiterate, thank you so much to everyone who's been watching this channel, subscribing, and you can also follow me on social media. I'll be back really soon because I'm hoping to be putting out a lot more videos. This one is hopefully coming out 3 weeks after the last one, and I eventually, well, really soon, hopefully, I'm going to be putting out 2 videos a month. So again, thank you so much. If you're subscribed, if you've watched this on my channel for the first time, thank you. And I will see you hopefully in the next one. As always, make sure to stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.